Western Europe, many of us like to think that we live in more or less egalitarian societies. Yet, over the past 40 years, we've seen increasing inequality, skyrocketing rents, and crumbling welfare services. And we wonder, what has happened to the welfare state? Can we still speak about its existence in its true form? And if so, can it survive our decreasing taxpayer basis and our aging populations?
Today, we welcome welfare sociologist from Pompeu Fabra, Gøsta Esping-Andersen, to the Room for Discussion stage. We will explore his extensive work, answering questions about how welfare capitalism, women's roles, family demographics, and political discourse is all interacting and reinforcing each other. So, without further ado, please join us in giving a very warm welcome to Gøsta Esping-Andersen. Hello. Come forward. Welcome.
Hello there.
Welcome.
Hello there.
And this is for you.
Well,
All right. Esping-Andersen, Professor, thank you for coming. We're very excited to have you here, and we're very excited to have the audience here as well. And let's get straight to it. You're most known for your work on welfare state and welfare capitalism. However, we found a quote from you in 2009 saying the following: "I solemnly promised myself that I would, from then on, dedicate my research and writing on anything but the welfare state." And we wonder what made you break this promise.
you wonder what?
What made you break this promise? You told yourself, "I don't want to write about this anymore," and you came back.
Well, a couple of reasons. One has to do with a woman who I think was an economist at that time. She convinced me that a good life requires that we change completely at least 3 times across our lifespan. Beginning, for example, as a social worker, then become an economist, and then become a garbage collector. Just to give an example. And I took that quite seriously for another reason, which was that it got to be very repetitive and uninteresting on the marginal side in terms of continuing doing research on welfare states. I really realized that I couldn't really learn anything new. There was very little new to say, and one of the things that contribute to that has to do with the fact that welfare state change doesn't happen very much. Once in place, they're very stable. So there's not a lot of new events that would trigger curiosity from the point of view of science. So those things combined made me I have actually changed 3 times. I started studying social democracy, then I went into the welfare state, and then I went to demography, which was in a sense logical because my doctoral studies were at University of Wisconsin, which is the high tower of demographics. So I went back in a way to my roots.
And how was the state of welfare studies when you began? Because in some people's eye, you are a pioneer in welfare research. But how did the research landscape look like when you began?
How did it start?
How did it start?
Well, again, there was a couple of things coming together. One had to do with that I was originally studying social democracies, and that obviously is closely connected to advanced welfare state development. So studying social democracy implies that you cannot ignore the welfare state. The other one had to do with a scholar called Walter Korpi, who was a professor in Stockholm, who invited me to participate in an international comparative study of welfare state development over the past century. And I thought that was an interesting challenge, so I participated, and then I kind of took off on that, and that is what became my kind of the foundations of the three worlds, or the very distinct kinds of institutional development of welfare states in terms of their coverage of the population, their degree to which they insured against risks, and other kind of dimensions key to the welfare state, and that was the starting point.
Yeah, so getting into exactly those topics, I mean, you've been working on this for a very long time now. You published this book on welfare capitalism back in 1990. Of course, a lot of things have happened in the world since then. So reflecting on the findings, the three types you found out about back then, how do you think that they have evolved since then? And does this broad characterization you paint still hold true?
Of course, what the welfare state looked like in, say, 1985 and what it looks like today is distinctly different. And I think the momentum that drove change came from women, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily. The second driver was deindustrialization and the rise of the new age service economy. Let's start with women. The revolution of women's roles implied new risks, but also a complete change in demands on the welfare state, in particular services. The original design of welfare states was very income security biased. And what women's revolution entailed and necessitated was more services that allowed greater compatibility between motherhood and careers. And that led some, but actually quite few welfare states to reorient their priorities in favor of more family servicing. And that is particularly the Scandinavian welfare states. Whereas others, as for example the United States, did not respond at all to the revolution of women's roles. That might also explain why you still have about 25% of American women who are basically housewives. In Denmark, I think you couldn't even find any genuine housewives. The few who do not work are primarily either because they are not able to or because they are ladies of luxury.
And this difference between these types of states, right, largely boils down to what you call decommodification, right? Could you explain a little bit what you mean by that idea?
Decommodification was a concept that I borrowed from a sociologist called Klaus Offe many, many years ago. He was the one that originally coined the phrase, and I kind of stole it from him. And what I mean by it is that you are less dependent on market exchange for your survival. That is, basic survival or degrees of economic well-being are being guaranteed, and that means that the individual is less of a commodity in the market and more a citizen. And that is what lies behind also the concept of social citizenship, that people's lives are guaranteed to a degree via social guarantees and not solely via how strong or successful people are in the labor market.
And
Decommodification means people are less commodities and more social.
And the way we understand the welfare state today, based on this decommodification that you speak about, is in popular eyes seen as a phenomenon that has its core in left-wing politics. And you, however, clarified in your book that decommodification of labor is something that has its root in the conservative tradition, right? So we wonder, how does a concept that is born from conservatism, how has it become so tightly linked to the left and progressivism as we see it today?
Well, you're right. There is this conservative tradition of also seeing people not as commodities, and not as social citizens, but is a much more kind of originally, a much more kind of authoritarian way of defining the role of the individual in society. They are subjects. And as subjects to the ruler, be it the Tsar or the Kaiser or the king, means that you are not just dependent on the market. So there's a decommodification element, as you were saying, also in conservative thinking.
For the past decades, you have dedicated yourself primarily towards understanding the role of gender equality in family demographics and in the labor market. And as we already touched upon a little bit, you call this revolution of women an incomplete revolution. And so what would make this incomplete revolution complete?
It would take 2 or 3 accomplishments. The first one is that women, like men, would see it as their natural and obvious life course objective to be linked to employment throughout life. See themselves as pursuing careers, exactly like men see themselves as pursuing a career, be it a big, formidable type of career or a more modest career. That is not the issue. But that you see yourself as that and you behave like that. So as girls, just like as boys, you're already orienting your studies, the way you think about your life in terms of thinking of yourself as a careerist. And that should be universal. That is the first and maybe the most important. But the second one is changing of men. So we've had the masculinization of women's life course, most advanced in Scandinavian countries, much more modest in the Netherlands, by the way, where most women have seen their lives as just being kind of part-timers with one foot in the family and one foot in some kind of a job. But in Scandinavia, it's basically universal. Women see themselves universally as being in the pursuit of a career in their life. And that is also a question of male adaptation. And the revolution of women's roles is very much contingent on what men do. So if we have the masculinization of women's roles unfolding, that will only be completed if we have a feminization of men's roles. And men tend to be quite reluctant to feminize. And that is the stumbling block for the completion of the revolution.
One thing you point out prominently in your recent book, Families in the 21st Century, is this correlation curve between level of gender equality and fertility rates, which is sort of like a U shape. How does that thesis tie into this idea?
This is opening a Pandora's box. Because that means we have to really start thinking about all the factors influencing fertility dynamics. That's a big issue. But, okay, you would expect that women, as long as they remained in their traditional role as housewives and mothers, that you would have high levels of fertility. Women would tend to have a lot of children. Even if you had birth control, you would still expect a traditional woman would have a lot of children. As the revolution of women's roles unfolds, starting with high educated women, of course, and much less with lower educated women, you will have kind of a dualization of the female side of the population, where you have the higher educated already beginning to masculinize their life course, but that's not happening among the less educated to a great extent. So you have kind of a mix. You have what I called multiple equilibrium. You don't have a new equilibrium, be it in terms of family life or be it in terms of the gender roles in the market. It is only when you get also the less educated and the more traditional women also to embrace that career-oriented life that you get the revolution of women's roles completing. Now, in economics, you would expect that once the development begins to unfold and develop more and more, you would have an acceleration effect. This is one of the big questions that we're facing today because we're not seeing it. We're seeing countries where, in fact, the revolution of women's roles seems to have stopped. United States of America is a clear example of the kind of the stopped midway and doesn't seem to progress anymore. In other countries, it seems to be rolling forward. But there are even indications from Scandinavia that women are beginning also to move backwards. So women that had embraced that career masculine type of identity are beginning to move backwards. So it is an open question whether we are going to see the completion of the revolution. But again, the revolution depends, and I must emphasize that, also on that men adapt. Now, most men, throughout most of history, did not do a lot of housework. And they still don't. But you do see a beginning of a convergence of males and females, partners' contribution to housework and childcare. For example, both in Norway and Denmark, and also Sweden, the male share of domestic duties is somewhere now about 40 to 43, 44% of the total. So you're beginning to see in Scandinavia a convergence. You don't see that in the Netherlands. You don't see that in Germany, where the male contribution has not increased to a dramatic degree as it happened in Scandinavia. And again, if the males don't begin to feminize, you're not going to have the completion of the revolution.
Right, so it seems you would argue that sort of the welfare regime of a country can influence sort of how the demographics evolve over time. At the same time, I think you could argue that the demographics can also influence how the welfare regime can evolve. And this is something we've seen a lot of change in since you published your book. For one, economic inequality has been on the rise steeply in many Western countries and across the world. I think many people are feeling that welfare services are largely deteriorating. As an example, in the Netherlands, percentage of social housing, something I think a lot of students are feeling the effects of, have decreased from 60 to 40% just in the 2000s. I think the question is, will these demographic shifts, aging populations, etc., force us to say farewell to the welfare state?
I just realized, and I'm sorry about it, I was supposed to talk about fertility, and I completely forgot.
You can do now.
And so let's move to the fertility side of the coin. Or more generally, family demography. Because fertility is very closely connected also to partnering and partnering behavior, and also to divorce behavior. Okay, fertility. I started with my observation that when women's roles were in the traditional mold, you had high fertility. You had a drop in fertility when you had this transition phase in the change in the role of women, where also the women's roles were confusing in terms of what is the correct way of that women should be and men should be. So a large kind of driving engine behind the falling fertility that we observed since the 1960s had to do with this process of changing roles, changing gender roles, both sides, men and women. You would expect that once you have the completion or close to completion of the revolution of these women's roles, fertility should go back up. It did, in fact. So you saw a recovery in the countries in which women's role change was most advanced, the Nordic countries, Northern America too, Canada and the United States. You saw a recovery and a quite significant recovery of fertility back up towards the two-child norm. And the proportion of women with 3 and even more children had also recovered to an extent. But there's something wrong with that explanation, because what we have seen in the last decade is all the countries that were the leaders in the recovery of fertility have all experienced a drop, sudden, out of the blue, in the early mid 2010 to 2020, fertility dropped throughout Scandinavia, most dramatically in Norway, for some weird reason, but also in the United States, sudden drop, just within a couple of years. Boom.
Do we know why?
Sorry?
Do we know why this happened?
Well, there's a big debate going on among demographers about why. One argument that became very popular over the past couple of decades had to do with values, and that they call them very often the postmodern values, more individualism, and self-realization and less commitment to institutions, and especially the institution of families. So more individualism meant also more fragile and unstable partnerships. That also means more divorce, and it also means less stable partnerships, and maybe even more singlehood. And we do see across the Western world a sharp increase in singlehood over the past couple of decades.
So what consequence do you think this has on the viability of the welfare state overall?
Well, it's not, the welfare state, to the extent that its construction was premised on stable families, which it was traditionally, is clearly going to be facing a lot of problems of adapting to much more unstable family life. But here we have to include a little parenthesis, because the instability of partnerships and the huge surge of singlehood is not spread throughout the population. What we're seeing, to the great surprise of many, is that the most educated are becoming more stable. And they're marrying more to a greater extent. And they're not divorcing to a greater extent. On the contrary, as I said, the higher educated are becoming stable. And they are having children. The low educated, on the other hand, are moving in exactly the opposite direction. Namely, more and more instability, more and more singlehood concentrated among especially low-educated males, which has to do with the fact that women, given that they now are surpassing men in education, they don't want to partner with low-skilled men. And one other reason has to do with the service economy and the decline of industrial jobs that in the old days provided income and job security for the low-skilled men. But those jobs are disappearing, and the low-skilled men are facing lives and a future and a life course that is not very attractive, that's very unstable, insecure, and that means also a trigger to less and less partner stability. And that, in turn, means less fertility. And what we're having right now in our epoch, in the last 20 years, is that high fertility is now concentrated among the high educated. Low educated are less and less fertile, and to a larger and larger extent, childless. In the United States, to illustrate, among the low-educated men, you have almost 40% that are childless. 40% of men of low education at age 45 are childless. That means they're going to spend their whole life probably being childless and single. And that same trend we see also in Scandinavia, we see it in France, and we see it, as I said, in Northern America.
There seems to be this huge rift emerging on many levels throughout society, right? Even in demographics, among different portions of the population. I think the question people are wondering is like, why did this happen? And there are many attempts to answer that. And I think one which is prominently raised now is that just the growth of our economies is simply too weak to kind of sustain this level of expenditure. I think the last time we did see a huge decrease in the levels of inequality was after the Second World War, where we also had an unprecedented economic growth. So do you think that this cuts to the bottom of what the problem is in some way?
Yes, well, let's see if I can connect back to the welfare state. Let me start with an illustration of a policy debate that erupted in Denmark last year. There was a proposal coming from women saying that women should have the right to prolonged interruptions from the labor market. And the government said, no way. And for a very good reason, because the very high expenditures that are required in the new service-intensive welfare state require maximum employment, because only with maximum employment will you also have maximum tax revenue to finance the welfare state. So you have here an equilibrium that is dependent on universal employment. And if that doesn't continue, the welfare state will be in crisis, financially speaking. We'll have to roll back its expenditures, its programs, and the most expensive ones are the social services, child care in particular, and elderly care, and health care. So you have here an equilibrium that is very, very, very vulnerable to the potential of women becoming kind of re-traditionalized, or in one way or another asking asking to be allowed to be less life course committed to employment. We need that women are all life course committed.
And when we talk about the welfare state and when we talk about employment rates, we can't look past the question of migration. And there has been a narrative on the populist radical right that immigration poses an economic threat to the welfare state and to its services. But as you made clear, we need to keep employment rates high. And so I wonder, is there a reason for welfare state to be selective regarding the migrants that they bring in?
Selective regarding?
Regarding the migrants that they bring in.
The life?
The migrants.
Oh, the
migrants, immigrants.
Oh, yes. Okay. This is a very difficult question to answer straight out. Most evidence from most countries concludes that immigrants are net positive contributors both to economic growth and also to government revenue. But there is if and buts. And the if and buts have to do with the composition of immigrants. Some immigrant populations are more capable of being net positive contributors than other groups of immigrants. And that has a little bit to do with the selectivity that some countries have introduced in their immigration policies. But if one wants the general conclusion in the literature, it would tell you that immigration has a positive effect, economically speaking. It also has a positive effect in terms of upholding fertility levels. Not only because immigrants, at least first-year immigrants, tend to have higher fertility rates than do local populations, but also because immigration contributes to increasing the size of the population of the country. So from a demographic point of view, immigration is positive and necessary. And probably, possibly, one of the reasons behind the sharp drop in fertility in the last decades has to do with that more and more countries are beginning to control immigration and actually expel huge populations of immigrants. And that might be one of the reasons, but we don't have any good empirical study of that yet, unfortunately.
Right. I think this is obviously a very contentious and relevant topic, and I think it's one many people probably have thoughts about. So we think this is a good opportunity to open up the discussion a little bit to maybe have some audience questions. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and we will select you.
My question relates to the need of a welfare system. Considering the welfare state mostly concerns a redistribution of income using the tax system, wouldn't it be better to simply have stronger trade unions that argue for better compensation packages for employees? Then no redistribution would be needed for most working people. Only the truly disadvantaged people with disabilities that prevent them from being able to work would need help.
So what exactly is the question?
It relates to the need of a welfare system. Like, if we simply had different, you mentioned the income inequality. So if we didn't have the income inequality because people argued for better salaries, and then they could simply use a part of their income to pay for a babysitter, women could buy it themselves. They wouldn't need money from the state to do that. Wouldn't that be better? Because indeed there are people who simply cannot work, who simply come from poor families and they have disabilities and they need welfare. But why would all women need it? I don't get that.
Well, redistribution in the welfare state is complicated. Most of the redistribution is not from the rich to the poor, or from the well-to-do to the poor. Most of the redistribution is across ages, from the young to the old. That's the lion's share of redistribution in welfare states. But there's also redistribution effects, of course, in terms of poverty alleviation or in terms of diminishing income inequalities. But that is relatively minor in terms of the overall volume. And that is in particular because the most effective anti-poverty policy has less to do with income transfers than it has to do with job creation. So if you wanted to introduce a very efficient anti-poverty policy, you would maximize employment among those who are most at risk of ending up in poverty. Of course, many of those who are at risk of poverty cannot work for reasons perhaps of health or other particular idiosyncratic reasons, and there you need obviously income transfers. Right? But if you look at a welfare state or a country like Denmark and look at the redistribution patterns of the welfare state, the magnitude of income transfers to poor families is very minor. What is much larger is family income support or universal family benefits. That is subsidizing part of the cost of having children. There's a political scientist in Denmark called Peter van Heusen who has been writing quite extensively about this syndrome. And his argument is that given the volume of transfers to families with children in Scandinavia, and Denmark is his key case. It is actually the family that's subsidizing the welfare state, not the welfare state subsidizing the family, because the family benefits volume for the family, for any given family, even with 2 children or 3 children, is tiny compared to the value of tax transfer that the family gives to the welfare state. I don't know if I answered everything that you were asking about.
Okay. Thank you for
Have I missed out on something?
We're very happy with your answer. Thank you. It's okay. And
You're happy? Okay.
I think we have time for one more audience question, if there's anyone. Hands up here.
We've been discussing the women's revolution and then the traditionalizing of women and the impact that that has on their place in the workforce. Also, men taking up more of the housework, feminizing men. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the impact of same-sex marriages on this part of the economy, and whether you thought that this development has any impact on same-sex marriages.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Whether you thought that same-sex marriages had any impact on the revolution of women in the workforce, and whether this re-traditionalizing has any impact on same-sex marriages.
That's a great question that has no answer. The problem of identifying such an effect is that the population of same-sex partnerships is relatively speaking so small, and survey data cannot catch that population. So you need registry data. And as far as I know, I haven't seen any study that has given anything that would even look like an answer to what the issue that you're raising. So I'm sorry that there is no answer, I think. But I think the effect would be really marginal. But I think, again, here we have endogeneity problems. And the endogeneity has to do with that the revolution of women's roles has also brought about an increase in same-sex, female same-sex in particular, partnerships. So there's an endogeneity between what is causing same-sex partnerships and what are the potential effects of same-sex partnerships on the revolution. I don't know if I explained myself clearly, but that's the only answer I can come up with.
Thank you very much for your interesting audience questions and for your answers. So, moving forward in this interview, we wanted to look a little bit at what the future might hold for the issues we've been talking about. And I think personally it might be useful to remember here that the welfare states we enjoy in large parts of Europe today were once built from the ground up. Especially in the decades after the Second World War, we decreased inequality a lot, right? Do you think that there's something we can learn from these previous labor movements in terms of how to orchestrate social change?
What you're saying is exactly right. The very strong labor movements were very much the driving force behind some countries' welfare state development, but not all. Certainly not in Germany or in Austria, where it was conservative governments. And puzzling enough, the big momentum behind the surge in child care services in Germany was Mrs. Merkel, who we cannot say was from a labor movement at all. So the conservative impulse is an alternative one that can also modernize. And of course, the reason that it can modernize is because there's pressure coming from the population. And that is in particular, again, very much related to the revolution of women's roles. Whether or not there's a strong labor movement, there is a strong kind of female movement that may or may not be well organized, but that will be putting very powerful pressure on the government to respond to the new needs of families with 2 careers, or single women with a lifetime commitment to their career. That is, the welfare state needs children, and in order, if subsidizing women's and helping develop compatibility between careers and motherhood is a necessity, you don't need necessarily a labor movement or even a formally organized pressure movement.
How can you do that? How can you facilitate higher fertility rates?
Sorry?
How can you facilitate higher fertility rates?
You mean, how are we going to return to high fertility given the drop? That's the question, yes. That is a very good question. One would be to open the floodgates of immigration. But that's probably a short-term, one-generation fix. The other one would be to, and that one I think is a much more persuasive strategy and necessity, would be, again, to repeat myself for the 10th time, to ensure the compatibility of women's roles and women's roles as mothers and careers. That, I think, is the most powerful requisite. And that particularly now, as I was saying before, has to be very much minted on the less educated population. And here we come to a third factor, which is the role of men. And less educated men are doing very poorly. And to what extent is that going to be a feature in terms of the long term? Probably not. Again, we're looking at generations and cohorts. The cohorts that we are seeing that are doing poorly will be dying out. It would take decades in many cases, but once we sort of have eased out that population, we should also have less low-educated men in the society, in the labor market, and in the marriage market. And that means that we would probably see a return to higher fertility. But that means also getting rid of the low-educated men in particular. But that's going to take many cohorts, a generation of change. But we can see it happening now with the share of low-educated men in each birth cohort is actually declining. And that's the good news. But it's going to take time. And some people say, and here we're back to some of the theories, say that it's all driven The low fertility is all driven by postmodern values, or some call it post-materialist values. But that is not a very persuasive explanation. Why? Because the fertility drop happened basically from one year to the next. In a very short time. Values don't change from one year to another. So it's very difficult to reconcile this theory of value change with the way that fertility dropped. And probably they may be right to an extent that there is more individualism in our society, but that would, you would guess that would be mainly among the more high educated than among the very low educated. Self-realization kind of urges and so forth and so on would be among the high educated. But we know from all the data that the high educated have a lot of kids. So that's not where the problem lies. So I would kind of maybe not put the post-materialist, postmodern theory in the garbage can, but I would be very skeptical about its capability to explain what's going on. I think a focus on women's role change will tell you much more.
And aside from time, the welfare state also needs money, right? And France currently, to bring in an example, is considering cutting public holidays, and to the outcry of many French people, they every once in a while try to bring up the retirement age, and this also doesn't go over very well. But are these the kind of decisions that governments need to be making in order to have enough money to keep up the welfare state?
Well, I think the best example to use to illustrate this issue has to do with the cost of retirement. Now, we know that the post-war baby boom generations are now going into the retirement age, and that is putting on huge pressures on public finances and on pension finances in particular. Now, the single most effective way to reduce that financial pressure is to prolong working life and reduce the number of years of retirement. And the best estimation, and this is basically coming from economics, not from demographers, is if we are able over the next decade to increase our working life years by 3 years, we will have stabilized the finances of the aging induced financial crisis. 3 years more working and less retirement would do the trick. That's very good news. But there is a hidden bad news behind that, because it might be inequitable, unfair. Because some people start working at age 16, some people start working at age 26. That means a 10-year difference in your contribution to the public purse. And it's the low-educated, the low-skilled that start very early. And they are also the ones that are most prone to health issues. And in old age, they smoke more, they live less, they eat less kind of healthy food, etc., etc., etc. Now, think of that once we come to retirement age. So if the retirement age officially is 65, one group of people, the low educated, they've been working and contributing 10 years more than the high educated. That's not fair. If we raise retirement age by 3 years for everybody, it's not fair. The low educated that started working much earlier, paying much more taxes throughout their lives, and they are also more prone to die earlier because of unhealthiness. They will have fewer years to enjoy their retirement income than will have the high educated population. So you need some kind of equity adjustment so that those who started early will also be allowed to, relatively speaking, retire earlier than the other ones. But then we're back to the problem that we need everybody to increase by 3 years to get the finances in equilibrium, according to the estimates. That means maybe what we should do is that the high educated should increase working years more than 3 years, say 4 years, compared to the less educated.
Yeah, that's one way of going about it, right? It's either decreasing spending, which a lot of states are trying to do now. The alternative is to increase taxes on some parts of the population. You think that's something we're going to see? Is that a better alternative?
Well,
Wealth tax, for example, is something that has been floated around a lot recently.
so,
Wealth taxes.
access to what?
Wealth taxes.
Wealth.
Yeah, it's something that has been floated around a lot recently, for example.
Yeah. What, on that, I really cannot talk intelligently at all. My research has never really dealt with the distribution of wealth. I really cannot say anything intelligent. I think there are people here probably that could say something more intelligent than I am able to do. Sorry, that is a topic I'm unable to talk about. Piketty, that you have here, he is an expert on that issue.
All right, and now after this hour of speaking about issues with the welfare state, possible solutions, and demographics, we started out with talking about your broken promise. Your broken promise was that you were not going to work with the welfare state, and you have continued doing so, and it's very closely related to your work on the incomplete revolution and in the families in the 21st century. So we'd like to wrap up by asking if there are any other interests that you think you want to get into in the future. Like this woman who told you you should change 3 times. Have you changed 2 times, 3 times, or what's the plan?
Well, I think I changed 3 times. I started with social democracy, then I did welfare state, and then I did families and family demography. And I'm continuing to do family demography. Right now, I'm very interested in figuring out what's going on about partnering behavior across kind of the social classes of society, or the socioeconomic strata of society, and why, especially at the bottom end of society, that partnering has almost collapsed. And why is that happening in some countries and not in others? And here's another puzzle that I think also is interesting. The fertility collapse occurred in 11 countries, all the Western countries, including the Netherlands, all the Nordic countries, including Finland, and Northern America, etc. It didn't happen in another group of countries where actually the opposite happened. In that same decade, they saw an increase in fertility, or stable at least. And that was Germany, Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, and other countries. That, in the same epoch, went in the other direction. Why? And I think that again it has to do with deindustrialization. That is, the Eastern European countries are still very, very, sort of, their growth is very much linked to traditional industrial jobs. And so after the big economic crisis of 2008, when you had economic recovery in the next decade, you had a booming economy and booming industrial jobs. And that's what I think made a lot of difference between one group of countries compared to another group of countries. But, I mean, then I'm staying in the same area of research, and I don't think at my age that I'm going to have a fourth change in my life.
Well, maybe. We'll see.
Except I love to do music, and maybe I'll get back together with my old rock and roll band and do a career playing bad rock and roll.
That would be absolutely incredible. And I bet you would have a bigger crowd than here in your rock and roll career, or not. But with that, we thank you very much for joining us here today. It was a great pleasure. Please join me and give a warm applause to Esping-Andersen.
Thank you.